We live in a world of big data, and people talk about big data all the time. But until data is actually sorted in a way that makes sense and truly open so that people can have access to it, the fact that we're surrounded by data doesn't change much.
Hi, my name is Todd Cranen. I'm here for Reason TV, and I am here with Chris Gates of the Sunlight Foundation, which is an organization that is dedicated to increasing transparency in government and politics. What is the Sunlight Foundation all about?
So the Sunlight Foundation was founded actually almost exactly 9 years ago. Our 9th birthday is just coming up, by Mike Klein and Ellen Miller, with a real focus on Congress originally, and it was about bringing more transparency and accountability to Congress.
And I'm just curious, how does it break down in terms, or does it break down in terms of the kinds of politicians who may support more transparency initiatives versus those who are a little wary of it?
It honestly doesn't. If you look at there are a few people who carry bills to try and make things happen, but invariably they struggle to get co-sponsors from either side. And it's just generally, there's not a huge constituency on either side of the aisle in Washington for this work, which is why the work is so hard. When people tell me that it must be tough to work in Washington where no one can agree on anything, I remind them all that they're incredibly naive and they don't understand how the world works, because in fact there's one issue where there's clear bipartisan agreement in this town, and that is that too much transparency and accountability are probably a really bad thing. And both parties seem to agree on that one.
And how about you mentioned Congress, but what about the executive branch of the president? And the president's come under a lot of scrutiny. He certainly came into office promising to be the most transparent administration in history. And I'm curious how you score him on that regard. What has he done right? What has President Obama done wrong?
You know, I'll leave the grading and the scores to historians, but from our perspective, there are some things that have gone well and some things that haven't gone well, and some real challenges. One issue was that in early 2013, he issued an executive order and asked every federal agency and department to develop, in essence, lists of all the data sets that they held, and they did that, and we applauded it. It was a great thing, because you can't, if you're Congress, you can't provide oversight over data that you don't know whether it exists. And if you're an activist, you can't FOIA something if you don't know whether or not it exists. And so it was a great thing that he said, let's have every agency develop the list of their data inventories. They did that, and then they went to OMB, and OMB declined to release them. So it was good that he asked for them, then they didn't release them. Then we FOIA'd them, and almost a year and a half later, just a few months ago, they finally released them, which we thought was good, so we're back to good. And then we actually just wrote about this today, that there are, I think, 5 departments that have still declined to put the lists of their data inventories on the data.gov website. So it's like cycles, it's good and bad.
Okay. And when you say data sets in general, what does that refer to?
So literally, until the president issued this executive order in 2013, departments themselves didn't fully know what data they collected and what data they had. Now that they've been released, we've discovered things that we didn't know existed and that Congress didn't know existed. And for instance, the Bureau of Land Management actually has a data set of complaints about unsafe conditions in mines that folks didn't know about. And if you live in a state like West Virginia, that's probably a pretty important topic and a piece of data that you'd like to see, but it's a piece of data that we didn't know existed until this was released.
I was just reading about that. In fact, there are tens of thousands of these mines that are spread out over federal land.
Right, and so it's interesting. We live in a world of big data, and people talk about big data all the time, but until data is actually sorted in a way that makes sense and truly open so that people can have access to it, the fact that we're surrounded by data doesn't change much. It's really what you do with it. And so in this case, it's about understanding it and understanding what's there, and then ensuring that it can be public and it can be released.
So you've had success with FOIA, and that's really good to hear. But my understanding, at least from my point of view as a journalist, is that Freedom of Information Acts have been harder and harder to come by because they've been easier and easier to deny. There are all sorts of loopholes that allow the government to restrict access and freedom of information requests. Has that been getting better over time? Has that been getting worse over time? What's the story with the rejections?
I'm not sure that you can have an overarching conclusion about FOIA requests, because they happen some are very political, some are not. Some are efforts at gotcha, some are fishing expeditions, and so I'm not sure that you can generalize. I think that that certainly in our experience, what we discovered was that we were never turned down, but it was simply the can kept being kicked down the road. And frankly, I'm not sure if we hadn't moved forward with the threat of a lawsuit, if we would have had the data released. The Department of Health and Human Services just announced, I think, a week ago that because of the difficulty of administering Obamacare, they wanted to let people know that it was going to be difficult for them to respond to FOIA requests because of staff limitations. That seems sort of like an odd evasion around that because of Obamacare, that FOIA requests would be slower to be responded to. And so I think there are good instances and bad instances. There are certainly folks that probably abuse the system and make sort of too many claims and political claims. But in general, I think it is really important that there be a clear system that allows people, whether it's Congress for oversight, whether it's journalists, whether it's citizens, to ask for this information and get this information. And unless there are clear and specific reasons why that information shouldn't be available, the default setting has to be on open.
And I'm curious also about if the Sunlight Foundation deals at all with sort of the unprecedented crackdown we've had on leakers, whether it's Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden or James Risen. We've seen people prosecuted under the Espionage Act in this administration to historic degrees. And I'm curious if that's a concern of the Sunlight Foundation and what can be done about that from your point of view.
I think traditionally we've been very supportive of whistleblower protection and think that it's really important that people not be prosecuted or persecuted for sharing information that is damaging to their employer or damaging to their organization. The place where we have not really entered the conversation is around national security, which is, I think, a very different conversation as it relates to Snowden or Assange or any of those sets of issues, Bradley Manning, that our focus has been more around the traditional, not national security related whistleblower, and we've been very supportive of whistleblower protection and critical of efforts when that protection hasn't been there.
I want to talk about one of the more interesting developments at the Sunlight Foundation too, this PolitOOPS.
Yep.
Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Close enough.
Close enough?
Yeah,
okay.
PolitOOPS.
So explain what is, I think it's very cool, explain what it is and how does it work?
So we follow the Twitter accounts of every member of Congress and a lot of elected officials around the country, and so we are able to tell if somebody posts something and then deletes it. We're not saying that people delete tweets because they're terrible people, because a lot of times you just post the wrong thing, but invariably there are great backstories that people post pictures of themselves at events and they later think, probably not the smartest thing for me to have been at that event or been with that person, and so it gets deleted. The Bo Bergdahl case was a great one where initially when he was released, there were many elected officials who were tweeting, congratulations, welcome home, American hero, because that was the original narrative, right? Before we heard more. And then there was this need, which is curious, to go back later and expunge the record and start deleting their tweets. And so it's a fun window into the world of framing and positioning and how people think about their public image in an era of social media.
Thank you for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, appreciate it.
For Reason TV, I'm Todd Cranen.